I think the Iranians almost definitely have the capacity to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. And I say that because the Yemenis have still successfully blockaded the Red Sea, but it would result in shortages on the global market, and of course that would lead to an uptick in the price of oil. Now, but if a war opens up in the Middle East in the coming weeks, I think that's the main thing that market analysts should be watching out for.
Surveys of professional investors and fund managers have revealed that geopolitical risks remain an elevated concern for investors. In fact, more so this year than any other of the prior years in recent history. We're going to find out why with our next guest, Philip Pilkington. And we're going to talk about recent geopolitical events, focusing on the Middle East in particular. Welcome to the show, Philip. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me, David.
Philip is the co-host of the Multipolarity Podcast, as well as a visiting fellow of the MCC. So make sure to check out his work in the links down below. Philip, it's your first time on the show. I'm excited to talk to you about geopolitical events. You told me offline that what's happening right now in Iran and Israel could have the potential to become a more severe or significant factor on the economy and markets than perhaps even the Ukraine war. Let's talk about that. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think it's relatively common knowledge in kind of geopolitical circles that if a war started between Israel and Iran, it would presumably mainly be some sort of missile and air war. I mean, so armies wouldn't cross; they're kind of too far away from each other, and so the Israelis will be presumably flying bombing sorties into Iran, and Iran will be responding with their large missile arsenal. It might not get to the point at first that they blockade the Strait of Hormuz, but if the Americans turn up, I think the general feeling is at some point, if it escalates, they blockade the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is the main gateway, effectively, to Middle Eastern oil and gas, at least the stuff that's put on ships. And that would basically be equivalent, a blockade of the Strait would basically be equivalent to the 1973 oil embargo when the Saudis said we're not sending any oil because the Americans in the West were backing the Israelis once again in the Yom Kippur War. And of course, that resulted in severe shortages in the United States. That wouldn't happen today because America's energy independent, but it would result in shortages on the global market. And of course, that would lead to an uptick in the price of oil. Now, we can discuss how likely it is to get to that, if you like, but I think the Iranians almost definitely have the capacity to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. And I say that because the Yemenis have still successfully blockaded the Red Sea, at the Gate of Tears there, and the Yemenis are supplied with Iranian anti-shipping weapons, and I'd imagine the Iranians have better stuff. So I think they can do the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. What would hold them up is basically regional pressure, and also I suppose they'd lose out economically too. So I don't think it will be the first thing they do, but if a war opens up in the Middle East in the coming weeks, I think that's the main thing that market analysts should be watching out for.
Do you think markets have been pricing in an escalation? Is that part of the reason where we're seeing a lot of volatility in risk assets this past week?
I don't think so. I mean, you run a finance show, like, you know that anytime there's jitters in the market, you hang it on whatever the fashionable story is. That seems to me pretty obviously to have to do with weaknesses in valuation in some of the Magnificent Seven stocks, together with the unwinding of the Japanese yen carry trade. So markets, I don't think, are pricing in a conflict scenario at all. And I think they're not doing that because we've seen so much global turmoil in the past 2 years that people are starting to find it a bit confusing as to what's going on. The oil market is an entirely different story. I've been commenting, at least on Twitter, I think I've written a few articles about it, that the oil market's been behaving pretty weird for the past year and a half. I'm not the only one to think that. A lot of professional oil traders and market analysts have got the oil market wrong for a very long time. But oil prices, last time I checked, are falling at the moment, or at least they have been in the past 2 weeks. And there is clearly a risk of this event. So I don't know. I don't think I'm the only one mystified at movements in the oil market.
Before I'm going to come back to oil in just a minute, but let's go back to Iran. So, we're talking about this event as the Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh was killed on July 31st. American intelligence revealed that perhaps it was Israel that was behind this. And so now Iran has vowed retaliation against Israel. The question is how and perhaps when. Can we answer any of these questions, how and when?
Well, how is definitely some sort of missile strike. Iran's whole strategy in the Middle East is based around building an enormous missile stockpile. I think they've got one of the biggest ones in the world. They definitely have the biggest in the region, and they've handed these things out like candy. We mentioned the Yemenis before. They've also given a lot of them to Hezbollah. Hezbollah have an enormous rocket arsenal as well. We don't really know how advanced they are. My sense is that some of the stuff is like slightly out of date Chinese designs. That's just from reading up on it in kind of American strategy think tanks, but that seems reasonable to me. Um, we don't really know how good these things are against Israeli air defense. Obviously, they launched a few in April. And it wasn't enormously successful, according to media reports. But I think the general feeling on that was it was a pretty restrained action. If Iran wanted to take an unrestrained action and, send a very large volley of missiles together with Hezbollah sending a very large volley of missiles, we don't really know what that would look like. I doubt it would be very pleasant for Israel. And the key question is if they want to go to kind of, that level. They've definitely made noise that they want to do something bigger than what they did in April. So I guess that's really all we know right now, and I don't think anyone outside of some bunker in Iran knows anything more really.
Well, that's a good point. A couple months ago, they launched roughly 300 missiles and drones across to Israel. They were all subsequently shot down. 99% shot down by Israel's Iron Dome defense system. Some called it a token gesture just to show that they did something. Is this going to be another token gesture where not much damage is going to be actually, planned out?
Well, if that happens, I think we're back to April and, you can put the whole thing to bed. But the Iranians have definitely made kind of more of an aggressive, they're making more noise this time. I don't think I'm the only one to notice that. So we don't really know. And I think rather than speculating, I think it's really just if this happens, and it really could happen like tonight or like tomorrow night or whatever, maybe it'll take 2 weeks. We don't know. But if and when there is a strike, I think people in markets will have to evaluate very quickly whether it is another token gesture or whether a bunch of stuff's been hit in Israel. If the latter occurs, I think Israel will probably have to escalate.
When you say Israel escalates, what does that mean? There's been some, again, speculation or analysis that Israel doesn't have the capability to fight a full sustained war with Iran if that were to occur. Do you agree?
I mean, the IDF's already tied up in the Gaza Strip and in South Lebanon in skirmishes with Hezbollah. Israel's a pretty small country. It's only 10 million people, or roundabouts, but they have a pretty impressive air force with a lot of American jets. So I guess in theory, they could fly bombing missions to Iran, in theory. So I think that's basically what the war would look like. Iran doesn't have I mean, it has a large military by any standard, but it doesn't have an enormous military. It doesn't have like Turkey's level of military. So their kind of, their strategy, as I said, is having an awful lot of missiles. And Iran's strategy is basically having the most advanced air force that they can possibly have. And so I think you'd kind of see a kind of an air war of sorts. I think that's what it would look like. But that doesn't really make it any less grim. And also, it must be noted on Iran's side, there can be a land war dimension in that Hezbollah can escalate in northern Israel, southern Lebanon, and in that case, the IDF might actually have a fight on their hands. And Hezbollah are pretty tough bunch by all accounts.
Are they going to drag in Lebanon into the fight then in a land war?
I mean, it's potential. I mean, a lot of people say that the Hezbollah are a proxy army of Iran. They're certainly armed and financed by them. So if Iran is really serious about going to war with Israel, I mean, the obvious thing to do would be launch some sort of an air war and then tell Hezbollah to kind of, go for it in a sense. The pieces are there for sure. And I think the Israelis know that. It's talked about in the Israeli press when I read it.
Let's take a look at the U.S. response. So I'm reading this ABC News article dated August 2nd. So last week, the Pentagon will send an additional fighter squadron and more warships to the Middle East to help defend Israel should Iran react militarily to this week's assassination of Hamas's top political leader in Tehran. The United States will also maintain an aircraft carrier presence in the Middle East as Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin ordered the USS Abraham Lincoln to replace the USS Theodore Roosevelt. What do you think the U.S. response would be if tensions escalate?
I can't see the United States not getting pulled in. I think it would be so difficult for them not to. The support for Israel, especially in the Congress, is so all-encompassing in a sense that I don't think DC will be able to tolerate Iran going, full scale with Israel or vice versa and not getting involved. The question is, how deeply would they get involved? Would it be a kind of a Ukraine situation where you continue to arm the Israelis? You give them probably a lot more advanced tech than they're giving Ukraine. Obviously, they've held out on the F-16s for a while. I mean, the Israeli Air Force is beyond F-16s at this stage. So it will be probably much more advanced munitions. That then the question will be, would the Americans and probably the British with their airfields in Cyprus, would they start flying sorties into Iran? They'd have to do it from the aircraft carriers. I'm not a military expert. I don't know if that opens up the aircraft carriers to potential strikes from Iranian anti-shipping missiles. I don't know, but I mean, I guess in theory it's a possibility. I guess the point is that if America will definitely back Israel, the question is to what extent, and if it actively engages in bombing campaigns against the territory of Iran, then presumably the Iranians declare war on America, or at least the American fleet in the region.
Let's talk about spillover effects on other countries in the region. Starting with Turkey, Turkish President Erdogan said on July 28th that we need to be very strong so that Israel cannot do these ridiculous things to Palestine, were his words in the speech. So my question is whether or not Turkey is going to get involved.
I don't think Turkey wants to get involved. Erdogan likes to talk, but that's to the domestic audience, obviously. The average Turk is very angry about what's going on in Palestine, so Erdogan has to speak to that. He has been the whole time, never taken any action. I believe a lot of oil goes from Turkey to Israel, and there hasn't even been sanctions on the oil. So they haven't even ratcheted up to step one. My sense, though, is that Erdogan would come under increasing pressure if there was a regional war. And in theory, then you could start to see economic sanctions, maybe. The question then is if the region started to destabilize, especially in Lebanon, at that point it becomes a Turkish national security issue and they might have to intervene. But I think that's a couple of steps down the line. And I don't think like anyone needs to be watching for that immediately. Possibly economic sanctions, though. And I think a lot of the oil goes from Turkey to Israel.
Well, we have to also keep in mind Turkey is a member of NATO, and the fact that Erdogan is speaking so strongly against Israel, perhaps it's just words, but their attitude against Israel, one of America's closest allies in the Middle East, would that put a strain on NATO alliances?
Well, I think Turkey's position on the war in Ukraine has already put a strain on NATO alliances. They've taken a pretty neutral position, and they're positioning themselves to become a gas hub for Russia at the moment and for other BRICS countries. So I think there's already a lot of strain there. Yes, but I think that's more of a problem for the West than it is for Turkey. We've still got a war going on in Ukraine, which is kind of a NATO-backed war, you might call it. And if this kicks off in the region and Turkey had to get involved and the West had to respond to that, unless the Ukraine wars come to an end or the situation on the eastern flank in Europe has become, come to a resolution, how do you how do you start shaking up the apparatus of NATO? How do you start chastising a member or trying to shake up the membership structure at the same time as you're trying to defend this Eastern Front in Europe? I think it will cause an awful lot of problems. I think, as I said, a lot more for the rest of NATO than for Turkey.
Russia might get pulled in. This is from Reuters, August 5th. Iran's president told a senior ally of Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin on Monday that Tehran was determined to expand relations with its quote-unquote strategic partner, Russia. Iranian state media reported. Sergei Shoigu, the secretary of Russia's Security Council, met Iran's president and top security officials as the Islamic Republic weighs its response to the killing of Hamas leader. What do you think Russia's going to do next?
I think the logical thing for Russia to do, and it's probably already doing it, is supply Iran with munitions. And I think this should be a huge concern, especially to the United States, because look, the Iranian missile stuff, again, not an expert, my sense is it's a little bit out of date. It's probably, 15-year-old tech or whatever. The Russian stuff's pretty new. It's been tested pretty extensively in Ukraine. And if some of that stuff gets handed over to the Iranians, I'm thinking anti-shipping stuff, it could be pretty dangerous munitions. And of course, Russia will turn around, I think they already are, and say, of course, we're going to back our ally in the region. You're backing Ukraine against us. So it's the kind of a tit for tat thing. So I think that's the logical thing. I've heard some people saying like Russia would extend their nuclear umbrella and stuff. I don't see that. I just don't think that's kind of a rational move. The rational move is to dump arms into Iran and probably advanced missile technology, maybe aircraft too.
So basically, are we seeing a second proxy war develop in the Middle East between Russia and the US through Israel and Iran? Is that what's happening?
Well, it could. We have to see what happens. But I think that's a much more reasonable interpretation. Some people are saying like World War III. I've heard these kind of like things that Israel and Iran go to war with each other, Russia pile in, America pile in, and 5 days later, everyone's dead from nuclear explosion. I don't think so. I mean, wouldn't it be much more rational for like Russia to say, okay, you guys have had your war in Ukraine. We're going to have our war in Iran now with pretty much the same strategic goals in a sense. I mean, you're not directly killing Americans, hopefully, but if you see what I mean, it kind of, if you look at it as kind of a chess game, it kind of makes sense, right?
Well, let's just theorize here. Why wouldn't it be World War III? What are the constraints to escalation into World War III?
I think for the same reasons that we've seen in Ukraine, like no matter the Ukraine war has been awful and everything, but I think both sides have managed to not allow it to escalate too far. And by too far, I think we effectively mean nuclear weapons, because at a certain point, any conflict escalates to nuclear weapons. Effectively, when a nuclear capable regime is under threat. And so I just even in the worst case scenario, let's say that Iran and Israel went really full on against each other, and Iran's a bigger country, Israel's got a more advanced weapons. Okay, we'd see how that shakes out. And then at a certain point, one of them's threatened existentially and launches a nuclear weapon. And of course, Iran may be developing a nuclear weapon as we speak, or may even have it already. We don't know. But they seem to have pretty good engineers, so I wouldn't be surprised if they could do this. Let's say that happens. And let's say you're Russia and you've been sending munitions to Iran, and the West has been sending munitions to Israel, or even maybe, flying sorties from carrier groups or something. Would we really then get involved? Would America launch nukes on Iran? Would Russia launch nukes on Israel? Like that seems to me like suicide. I think at that point you go, okay, I think I've had enough here. Hopefully it doesn't get to that point, of course, but I'm just saying that seems to me like the worst possible thing that can happen in the Middle East. And it seems to me like it would probably be in everyone else's in the world self-interest to leave that contained to the Middle East. The real wild cards there, as far as I understand it, are countries like Pakistan and potentially Turkey if they could get access to a nuclear weapon. But right now, that seems like the worst case scenario. I just think Ukraine has really showed us, and I really don't mean this positively, I'm very against all this war stuff, but Ukraine has shown us that, you can contain this thing without like everybody getting blown up in, Fallout 3 video sequence or whatever.
So ultimately, if this were to escalate, I'm not saying it will, but if it were to escalate to a more kinetic confrontation on either side, what is the immediate market impact?
A good question. I mean, in theory, oil prices should go up. They did go up after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We all remember that. It was quite dramatic. And obviously natural gas prices went absolutely bonkers, especially in Europe. I'd expect there to be a similar response if the oil market, and to a lesser extent LNG probably market, I guess, is rational. But as I've said, the oil market's just been behaving so strangely recently. I don't really want to make a call on it either way. Rationally, though, that is the response. The moment any kinetic activity kicks off between in that region of the Middle East, this isn't just the Yemenis and the Red Sea. At that point, oil supplies to the rest of the world. Therefore, world oil markets, especially Western Europe, and Western Europe has very adjacent markets to the United States. Think of the LNG connections, a little bit of oil import these days. That should put pressure on them. Now, the markets we may not see any actions, and the markets may rationalize it by saying, well, there hasn't been any actual stoppage of oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, my thinking on that is you price risk You put risk into a price, but it may have no immediate impact. It will have an impact on Israeli markets, obviously. If you go back and you look at the Israeli stock market and the shekel after October 7th, they really took a dive, and presumably this will happen again. But I wouldn't actually be surprised if we only saw some short-term action in the oil and gas markets. And I only say that because I think these markets are behaving a bit strangely right now. They should price it in.
Do you see a major shift in foreign policy after the election this year? Well, first of all, are there major differences in attitudes towards the Middle East between the Democrats and the Republicans right now?
Well, there definitely are. I mean, the Democrats obviously have just changed out their candidate, and they have a candidate much more skeptical of Israel. That's very clear. I think they're messaging that quite hard. Kamala Harris has announced she's changing her entire national security team. Didn't get that much coverage actually, but she is. So it feels to me like the potential Harris administration is gearing up to have well, they have a different foreign policy team, so it'll be a different foreign policy. How different we don't know because the candidate hasn't really laid anything out. Obviously, Trump historically has been much more pro-Israel, helped with the Abraham Accord negotiations through his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. But I've seen Trump say one or two things that were a little bit skeptical in the region. But I think ultimately the backing of Israel in the Middle East is mainly through the Congress in the United States. And I don't think the executive branch can really make it full on. I mean, they ultimately make a call, but there's an awful lot of pressure and so on. So in terms of Middle East, remains to be seen. I don't know. I don't think anyone really knows. In terms of Ukraine, I mean, it's been very obvious that the Trump team has signaled that they want to wind down there.
Let's finish off on the Ukraine conflict. Former British diplomats in Moscow have recently signed a letter calling for a negotiated settlement between the Kremlin and Kiev. And reported that over 40% of Ukrainians support peace talks. And my question is whether or not peace talks between Russia and Ukraine are more realistic today than they were maybe 2 years ago.
Oh, I think definitely. I mean, the war hasn't gone probably as either side thought, but certainly not as the Western Ukraine and the West thought. It's not going in any good direction. That's clear. We have an election coming up. Trump has signaled that he wants to stop this on day one. He's appointed JD Vance as vice president. JD Vance has made the Ukraine war one of his major issues, even when he was just a senator, junior senator. So that's very clear. We don't know about we don't know her positions yet, but I think the change of foreign policy team is very indicative. It would seem very strange to me that, the narrative around Ukraine has changed so much and the events on the ground have changed so much, and then you change out your national security team and you have exactly the same policy. That seems to me to be highly unusual. I think I heard as well that President Zelensky in Ukraine is floating the idea of having a referendum on peace talks, which is kind of actually an interesting idea. I think the ground has shifted on this an awful lot. And I mean, I'd really be surprised if the Ukraine war is still going on a year from now.
What do you think is the most likely outcome from now to a year later?
Probably Russia gets to keep the Donbass. I mean, their troops are there. So unless there's something very, very good to offer them, and I can't really think what that will be, their bargaining position is basically, well, if you guys push any further, we walk away from the peace negotiations and we restart the war. So once you have, troops in an area and they can't be dislodged, you're in quite a strong bargaining position. So somebody making a case that any of that land can be reclaimed would have to come up with a very attractive proposition that Ukraine and its allies could offer to the Russians. Now, perhaps there is. I'm not a diplomat, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I don't think Russia would give up that land, for example, for sanctions relief. I think they've baked in the fact that the economy is sanctioned and it's growing reasonably well and so on. So I don't know what the leverage would be in a negotiation to try and get Russia to give up that land. Perhaps I'm wrong. I'm not a diplomat.
Okay, so I've heard all sorts of opinions on this issue, and one of the opinions I've heard is that if Russia were to keep the eastern part of Ukraine, they would just want more. Eventually, they're going to move west, and their objective is to take all of Ukraine. Is there any truth to that whatsoever?
I don't think anyone knows. I think if I were the Russians, I'd probably want the rest of the Black Sea coast, just from a logical point of view. They're very fussy about the Black Sea. That's why they marched into Crimea. They have their fleet there. Making Ukraine landlocked would be kind of attractive from a defense point of view. I don't know what they'd really do with the rest of Ukraine, but I mean, anything can happen. I think the issue is that when people say, well, if we give them the Donbass, then they'll, continue to march or they'll start up a war in 5 years' time or something like that. I mean, the only thing I'd say to that is, well, how are you going to get the Donbass away from them? I mean, there's really only two ways of doing that. What I suggested, which is you must have a very powerful piece of bargaining that you can say, we'll give you this, you give us back, you give Ukraine back the Donbass, or you have the capacity to militarily extract the Russian army from those areas. First of all, I don't think that capacity is there. It hasn't happened, so I don't see it. And the Ukrainian army is weaker than it was when it first tried in the counteroffensive a few months ago. And so I don't. I mean, and also that would preclude any negotiations. So that would require continuing on with the war. So when people say that, I'm just kind of like, you may be right, you may be wrong, but what are you going to do about it?
Philip, this is a fantastic talk. Thank you for breaking down what's currently going on with us today. Before we go, tell us where we can find your work.
I mean, most of my stuff's on Twitter at Philip Pilk, PhilipPilk. And I'd say check out the podcast. It's kind of a mix between geopolitics and markets. Some people call us doomers. We think we're realists. And that's www.multi-polarity.com. You can also find the link in my bio.
And based on just, your work and what you've been observing, what in your opinion are the, I guess, top geopolitical hot spots for investors to watch out for right now? Is it what we talked about
Middle
today or
East.
something else? Middle East?
Definitely Middle East, but also South China Sea. I don't think that's been put to bed yet. And actually, I said Ukraine was kind of DEFCON 3 on the market impact. Middle East is DEFCON 2 because of the Strait of Hormuz. Conflict over the South China Sea is DEFCON 2 is DEFCON 3 because it could mean sanctions on China like we've seen on Russia. And the integration of supply chains between China and the West is so profound these days. We almost can't make anything without Chinese inputs, and them too. I mean, they have a lot of reliance on us. That would be the geopolitical macroeconomic event, the biggest one since probably World War One or something like that. We hope it doesn't happen, but things haven't settled down there. We're just slightly distracted by it. Taiwan has a new president. We'll see what happens. Always worth keeping an eye on, but not obsessing on if you're trying to manage a portfolio.
So it could have the potential to escalate to a really big event, but so far, currently, right now, it's still the Middle East.
Yeah, and just to be really clear, even if the South China Sea wasn't a huge event from a war point of view, even if it was a limited naval war, my concern will be the sanctions and counter sanctions. Because I'm not clear that policymakers have enough of a sense of how interconnected the global economy is. And I think they would associate imposing sanctions on China as we did with Russia, which was painful but manageable. I don't think China will be manageable. I think it will be all pain all the way down.
I definitely like to follow up with you and talk more about China and Taiwan and the developments there and the U.S. U.S. China relations as well. Thank you very much, Philip, and we'll put the links to your work in the description. So make sure to check out Philip's work there. Description down below. I'll speak to you next time, Philip. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.